Hello there. Today we're talking about the brand new Focal headphones for 2024. I have here the closed back Azurys and the open back Hadenys. There is no scenario where I don't butcher the pronunciation of this headphone, so I am truly sorry in advance. Please let me know how to actually pronounce this in the comments below. Now, just a disclaimer, these are both demo units sent over by Focal for review. As usual, I have not been paid to say anything in particular about them. I do not get to keep them, and all thoughts and opinions here are my own. Big thanks to Focal for sending them in for review. If you're at all familiar with Focal's other headphones, they often trend around a similar kind of sound signature. The open back headphones are usually about tight, well-controlled punchy bass, and a forward character to the mids at around 1.5 kHz. While the closed backs, apart from the Elegia, have a notable mid-bass bump, followed by a fairly substantial dip in the lower mids to keep the rest of the response clean. And both of these headphones go for something a bit different, but we'll get to that. First, let's take a look at them. Let's go over how they look and how they feel. So as you can see, there's a strong resemblance to the Bathys, Focal's fairly recent ANC headphone. Clearly they're using the same tooling platform, which makes sense to do. And they're also maximizing the use of the driver they made for that headphone. So they're using the M-shaped dome driver that's found in the Bathys, which from my understanding was developed originally from the Celesti. But do not think that just because these look kind of like the Bathys and they're using the same driver, that they sound similar or that the sound signature is similar, because it's not. And despite what marketing might tell you, there is in fact much more to sound quality than just the driver. It's all about the implementation and the rest of the acoustic design as well. And of course, the Bathys is active while these ones are passive. With these new ones, you'll notice a few differences from the Bathys as well. The pad material and the underside of the headband are different. While the pads are very soft and cushiony, the leather pads of the Bathys definitely look and feel nicer than the cloth material that's used on these. But as far as everything else is concerned, things are fairly similar. You've got the same sort of tapered yoke structure going on here, the same cosmetic backing with the circles for the closed back, and with the open back, the design here uses a honeycomb style backing, more similar to what you might find with the Clear MG. Importantly, the headband is also different from the older Focal models, and that makes sense to do since there were reports of some of those ones breaking in certain conditions. Now, that's never happened to me personally. I've never seen it happen. I have no idea under what circumstances that's happening, but I'd say that in general, it is a good thing when headbands don't snap. Now, of course, the Bathys has only been out for a bit, but I have yet to see any reports of that happening on those ones. Time will tell. As always, be careful with your expensive stuff. Aesthetically, I'm not a big fan of the blue on the closed back. It sort of makes me think of your grandmother's tablecloth or like a doily. Something that might fit with that kind of vibe. And sure, they're taking risks by making something that's, bright and colorful and isn't just sort of bland and boring looking, but I like bland and boring looking. I am bland and boring looking. With the open back Hadenys, they've gone for a more brown earth tone look to it, and I quite like this. I especially like the matte look of the cups. It's a bit shinier on the Azurys. Now for comfort, this is where these headphones really shine. These are some of the most comfortable headphones I've had the pleasure of wearing. They both weigh around 300 grams, and that is far lighter than any of the older Focal headphones. And I actually don't know how this is going to be received by the community, since a lot of the time when you pick up heavier headphones, it feels like it's more premium. It feels like there's more headphone there. And I imagine that for some, it's actually going to influence how they feel about the sound quality. It's a subconscious thing that many don't realize has an influence on how they judge a product, but it is something that has the potential to affect all of us. And let me just say that I love the lightweight nature of these headphones. I can wear them all day. This is the exact change that I've been wanting from Focal when it comes to their ergonomics. So big thumbs up on comfort, ergonomics, and all of that stuff. And of course, just like the Bathys, you get tilt and full cup swivel. They're not collapsible, but they do fit nicely inside the carry case, which is also slim, so you can, chuck it into a bag pretty easily. The pads are very comfortable. Here's the size of the opening. It's not the largest opening, and the bottom of my earlobe does touch the bottom of the pad, but it's definitely enough. I do think the overall design here could have been a tiny bit bigger, like the cup design itself, but I'll happily take the trade-off of my earlobe touching the bottom for the weight reduction. So this is absolutely a breath of fresh air. One thing in particular, though, that I don't like is the single entry cable system. And the cable itself is a bit of a nothing burger cable, even though the closed back cable does have a microphone on it. I think that they're expecting folks are going to be using these for like Zoom calls and stuff like that. Now, that's the mechanical and industrial design out of the way. Let's talk about drivability. So these headphones are both very easy to drive. You can run them from just about anything. Here is the impedance curve, and I'll put the specs up on the screen for you. You'll notice that there is a bit of an impedance bump for the open back. So I recommend if you want just the default response, stick with something that has low output impedance. I am, of course, running this from the Vioelectric HPA V550 and the Matrix X-Saber Pro as my current reference equipment. Okay, let's now talk about the sound quality, and we'll start with objective performance, and then I'll go into my subjective take a little bit later on. And I'm going to be talking about the open-back Hadenys first and foremost, because the response actually is very, very similar between the two. So I'm showing you guys here the frequency response done on the B&K 5 and 2.8. I'll be showing you guys the gross measurements here shortly as well. But here you're seeing both the raw and the calibrated measurements. If you're new to reading any of these graphs, I'll leave some resources linked in the description that can help. But the shaded area you see here is the preference bounds that's been lifted from the Harman research. And in short, there are many different ways for things to sound bad, very few ways for things to sound good, and when they do, they typically fall somewhere within this range. And by contrast, when something goes outside of this range, it's more likely to be perceived as a coloration of some kind. And with both of these headphones, things do generally fall within the preference bounds, so this is mostly good. But I actually want to focus on the raw measurements for this one, because there's something interesting going on here with the ear gain. But first, let's take a look at the bass. So this is kind of remarkable. This is an open back headphone with an elevation up into the sub bass. You almost never see that. Like in the vast majority of cases, the best you can get with open back headphones is flat linear bass extension. Or if there is a bass boost, it's done in a way that's significantly higher up in frequency and often sort of clutters or muddies the mids, and you lose out on clarity for the rest of the response. And if you think about what headphones like the HD600 or HD6XX are missing, it's exactly this. So what can I say? I am pleasantly surprised to see a bass rise into the sub bass like this, like what you get with the Hadenys here in an open back headphone. The mid-range is also pretty good. It's smooth, it's clean. Importantly, it doesn't have that bump at around 1.5 kilohertz that you see with the other focals like the Clear and the Elex. And with this region pulled back a bit, it loses some of that sort of typical focal character, but for anyone who found the focal openbacks to sound a bit claustrophobic, that's entirely gone with these. Now, here's where things get interesting. For the ear gain region, this is where the ear most strongly amplifies frequencies along the path to the eardrum. You'll notice that it's slightly shifted upwards, closer to 3.5 kilohertz. So on the one hand, this presents as kind of a peak at around 3.5 kilohertz. But at the same time, the general shape of the ear gain is intact. It's kind of the shape you want for various tones to come across clearly and sound normal. It's just that the whole thing is kind of shifted upwards. Now, this region of the frequency response can have a particularly strong impact on the perception of timbre. So while everything sounds cohesive and intact, the timbre is what gets sort of slightly skewed. And I'm talking about like the concept of like metallic timbre for focal headphones. This is a little bit of a different thing, and it's a very subtle thing. So I'm very curious how this is going to be received by people, since this could also shift around depending on the person as well. For me, I find that on most recordings I don't really notice it all that much, but occasionally I hear this sort of timbral shift, particularly with electric guitars and percussive hits. And when I EQ this feature to be just a little bit lower down, closer to 3 kilohertz, it sounds a bit more natural. Again, it's very subtle, and on the open back, this doesn't cause any real glare to my ear, so it's not like fatiguing. But I did find I preferred it with just this one small little adjustment with EQ. Let me know if you guys have a chance to listen to this headphone. Let me know if this is something that you guys notice as well. Now, for the rest of the treble, the response is actually pretty solid. It's actually more smooth than what you get on the Clear, which could occasionally have kind of like this gritty kind of character to it. And this doesn't have that. This is more just smooth and clean and clear sounding for the treble, at least on the open back. And one thing I actually noticed here when I was doing my measurements is that there is a potential peak at around 6.3 kilohertz depending on the pad deformation and the pad compression. So if there is a looser clamp, this peak shows up, or it shows up as a peak there, and you'll see this on the closeback. But if the clamp pressure is tighter, that peak goes away completely. It actually becomes a null. So depending on the person, again, this is a feature that may shift around a little bit, but just so you guys get a sense, I don't actually hear this personally, so for my ear, it's actually closer to the measured result here. Now, here you can see how it measures on Gross relative to Harman, and you can see the features track similarly with a few subtle differences, since this is effectively a different head. And I would say that for the open back headphone, this isn't one that needs EQ by any means, but I did make some subtle adjustments like I mentioned. Here is the EQ profile that I came up with, along with the result. Feel free to try this one for yourself if you get this headphone in and see how it is, but I just shifted the ear gain down a little bit. Moving on to the closeback, the Azurys, it actually measures very similarly. In general, this is a fairly competent response for a closeback headphone. You get a bass elevation that, while centered around the mid bass, is a bit less than what you get on other closed-back focals, at least from the ones that I've measured. They have a much more pronounced kind of mid bass bump to them. Instead, you get more of a typical bass shelf, more kind of like a Harman-like bass shelf without as much of that mid-bass rotundness to it. The mids aren't quite as cleaned here as they are on the Hadenys, but they're still pretty good. And then you get the same feature in the upper mids and lower treble. And for whatever reason, I hear this feature on the closed back more. So that 3.5 kilohertz bump comes across a little bit more like glare to me with the closed back. So again, that's one thing that I EQ down on the Azurys. The 6.3K feature, once again, I feel like this is going to be a phantom peak because it's not perceptually relevant, but it does show up in certain conditions, and I just wanted to show you guys that here. Here it is on the Gross system relative to Harman. Once again, the features track fairly similarly. And here you can see my EQ profile for the closed back. You'll notice I made a lot more adjustments with this one, but again, your mileage may vary because these features can shift around a bit from person to person. And here is the distortion performance for both of these headphones. It's not as good as what you get with certain planars, but you shouldn't have any trouble EQing these if you want to. So I would say this is actually better than what you get with the Sennheiser HD6 series, but not as good as what you get with like an Odyssey, of course. The Odysseys are crazy for that. Importantly, I didn't find any issues with clipping at high volumes with these ones. That was sort of a thing that happened with the older Focal openbacks. If you ran them out of a high output impedance source, or if you tried to EQ the bass, you would reduce the volume threshold for where they would clip. But I believe by default that would be at around 107 dB at 1 kilohertz. With these ones, I did not observe that to be happening. I ran them higher than that, and I did not get them to clip. And once again, all of this stuff will be posted on the forum thread linked below. Now, let's talk about how they sound subjectively. And of course, this is my description of the experience, not a description of acoustic properties necessarily. So, like I mentioned earlier, the open back sounds better between the two, to me. And quite frankly, I'm generally impressed with this one, mostly. So for the sense of resolution and detail, there's really nothing to complain about. Nothing sounds blunted or smoothed over or lopped off or missing. And I actually find that for the treble itself, it walks a good balance between, smooth and extended, or smooth and having presence to it. So it's not too much to my ear, but it still sounds very clean and clear. So all the overtones for various different instruments will ring out clearly the way they should, and this doesn't come at the cost of harshness or sibilance or anything that would otherwise be fatiguing. So it's a really nice balance there for the treble. Now, when it comes to soundstage, like I mentioned, this doesn't have that forward 1.5 kilohertz character to it that some of the other focals have, so it's more spacious sounding than the Clear, it's more spacious sounding than the Elex. Far be it for me to suggest what you're hearing, but to me, that's kind of how it sounds. So I'd say things are mostly good here for the intangibles, but there are two things to note that are maybe less good. I mentioned before that there's this sort of shift going on for the upper mid-range, and this has a consequence to timbre. And I think maybe some people hear me say that and think, oh, he's talking about, the Focal metallic timbre, but it's not that at all. In fact, these don't have the particular frequency response features that are responsible for that. And like I mentioned, this isn't something I'm sure that people will even notice, but it was something that I noticed when I was listening to certain Tool recordings. The band. So there are certain songs that they have a unique kind of character to their guitar tones and bass tones. And I found that the main edge and focus of those tones is slightly muted or pulled back in favor of the overtones for those instruments. And it just caused things to sound a bit unfocused. And after applying my EQ adjustment to it, into the upper mid-range, this character completely goes away. As an HD600 enjoyer, I find I prefer the timbre point of focus to be in a spot that's a bit more similar to where it is for that one. So I would rate the timbre of these two headphones to be not as natural sounding as what you get with the HD600s, but for different reasons from maybe what people would have critiqued the Focal headphones in the past. Now, the other thing to note is that there's also a kind of richness and fullness to the sound that is imparted by the increased bass presence. And while that's likely to be enjoyable or preferable to people compared to just not having that, the trade-off is that you do lose a bit of that sense of tactility and nimbleness to the bass that you get on the Clear. So it still has a sense of impact to it, but not that kind of like tight, hard-hitting attack that you get from the open-back focals, so the Clear and the Elex and the Utopia. And these new ones sound a little bit dynamically constrained by comparison. And for the closed-back across the board, things are mostly similar, which is to say, mostly very good. I just don't find it to sound quite as clean and smooth sounding as what you get with the open-back Hadenys. At least that's how I hear it. But overall, I find both of these headphones to be reasonably competitive, with the open back being particularly interesting, so much so that I may actually end up buying this one. While it's not exactly a straightforward upgrade over the HD600, certainly not in the timbre department and that sort of natural presentation that it has, it is better in a number of ways. And it's certainly an upgrade for the ways in which the HD600 and HD6 series are meaningfully lacking. That, of course, being the bass response and also the bass capability. And all of that while being actually more comfortable than the HD600. This doesn't have the same kind of clamp pressure that you get on those. But I just want to make note of that. It's not just that the HD600 rolls off in the bass. It's also limited when it comes to what you can do with EQ down low, because things sort of fall apart due to harmonic distortion reasons when you try and push it too far. And with the Hadenys, the adjustments that I make with EQ are actually far less significant. Like, they're far less in overall level. And so these are things that with the Hadenys I don't need to worry about. And again, I think this is really only something to care about for those who are hyper-focused on getting the absolute most out of things. By no means am I going to suggest that you need to EQ this, and the same goes for the HD600 as well. So I still expect folks in the anti-EQ gang to be very much okay with the Hadenys, and probably the Azurys as well. This is just me, being particular. Now, compared to the Clear and the Elex, the Hadenys is smoother in the treble, it's rounder, richer in the bass, and it has also less colored mids. So there are actually reasons to consider the Hadenys over the Clear and the Elex. But I do still think that the Clear and the Elex are better at certain aspects, specifically when it comes to that sense of tightness and tactility in the bass. And the upper mid-range presentation from 3 to 4 kilohertz, I'd say, is a bit more focused on the Clear and the Elex than it is on the Hadenys. So if you're not going to be EQing things and you're particularly sensitive to that feature, the Clear and the Elex might still be the ones to go for there. And for the Azurys, I'd say similar things compared to the Celesti and the Radiance. While the Azurys improves on them in certain aspects, like the sense of spaciousness, for example, and it also has a more balanced tuning for certain regions, it's just not a straightforward invalidation of those headphones. In fact, while I personally enjoy the Hadenys more than the Elex, and maybe even the Clear, I would probably still choose the Radiance over the Azurys. And when it comes to other closebacks, the Azurys is competitive with the good ones, and I say that with the recognition that I can count the number of good closeback headphones on one hand. There's really not that many of them. But here's the thing, it's also not necessarily better than any of them. Like, I can still see a case for the Aeon 2 Noir or the Aeon X Closed. I've actually regularly recommended the Aeon X Closed, the one from Mastrop there, as, one of the better closebacks out there, certainly for the price. And I don't think the Azurys sounds categorically better than any one of those. Even though the Azurys is definitely more comfortable than those for me, it's more just about different strengths and weaknesses. So what's the conclusion here? How do I think about these two new headphones from Focal? Well, I think they're both reasonable, competitive, solid releases, but it's the open-back Hadenys that is the headphone that, in my opinion, is the one that's particularly impressive. So again, it's not going to replace that tactile, punchy, audiophile kind of sound you get with the Clear, but it would also be wrong to call it a lesser Clear, because again, I can see people choosing this over the Clear. Instead, what you get is an alternative sound signature, one that's actually more likely to have a more broad appeal given its more Harman-like traits. Is it going to be for everyone? No, but it's the kind of headphone that I've been looking for a while. So it is a competent, well-tuned open-back headphone with a bass shelf, and it's one that has it in the right spot, which is kind of remarkable. So I strongly feel that between these two headphones, it's the Hadenys that stands out. I am sorry for the pronunciation. The Hadenys that stands out, and it easily gets my recommendation. Just make sure you take note of that sort of timbral thing going on. The Azurys, while it measures similarly, and depending on who you are, you might even say that it measures better. I know people who've said that. I find that one quirk in the ear gain region to be more pronounced, at least it is on my head. And so I have a bit of a harder time with this one. But when you look at the landscape for closeback headphones, I would have a hard time saying that the Azurys isn't in the ballpark with the good options there. And the only consideration I'm thinking about with both of these is that since they're so lightweight and the pad material is a bit less fancy than what I think the community has come to expect from a Focal product, I'm really not sure how these are going to be received by the community. This is unrelated to the sound, but you would be surprised at how common it is for people's experiences to be affected by these things. So, the various biases and placebos involved with heavier, fancier feeling materials. It's kind of like the whole, graph readers are listening with their eyes thing, just based on factors that are totally unrelated to sound quality. But for those who are uniquely focused on sound quality and the acoustics, there's very little to complain about here. Anyways, that does it for this video. As usual, there will be a forum thread below with all the graphs and my EQ profiles and ongoing discussion with these two headphones, so check that out. If you found any of this useful, consider subscribing. It's something you can do for us for free, and it really helps us out. And you can also read our deep dive articles up on headphones.com or chat with me and other like-minded audio folks in our Discord, also linked below. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.